Hello and welcome to our next Access 21 session, the role of a staff-centered diversity, equity, and inclusion committee in an organization. Our presenters today are from the American Physiological Society, Stacy Brooks, Director of Marketing and Communications, and her colleague, Dr. Rebecca Ostis, Director of Government Relations and Science Policy, will be leading our discussion. We would like to thank McKinley Advisors for sponsoring this session. We appreciate your support on this important and timely topic. Before we begin, here are your quick reminders for this session. Now I would like to invite our presenters to the virtual stage. Stacy and Rebecca, please take it away from here.
Hello, thank you everyone for being here with us today, and thanks to Sarah for the great introduction. I'm Stacy Brooks-Watley, and my colleague Rebecca Ostis and I are happy to be here with you today. So last summer, many organizations accelerated their DE&I efforts after the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many others during our societal reckoning on race. APS was doing some similar soul searching. While we had a decades-long history building programs that supported scientists from underrepresented backgrounds, we wanted to figure out how we as an organization could do more to increase diversity in STEM. So how could we build on those past efforts to help our members advocate for more representation and more inclusive work environments, protect and build diversity among the next generation of scientists, and so many more questions. But the circumstances that surrounded these discussions weren't happening in a vacuum, and certainly not within the vacuum of science alone. The staff who were working to come up with how we attack these problems as a staff team were also living through and affected by the events on a deeply personal level. So while these were extremely important questions to answer for our members, our staff leadership also knew that we must consider these diversity, equity, and inclusion topics for our staff as well. So today in our session, we're going to talk through a case study of what we've done at the American Physiological Society to improve our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts for our staff team. We'll touch on these learning objectives here, really looking at some of how the work that we did on our group dovetailed and differed from what we were doing for our members, how we built a structure that can really contribute to that solid organizational change, and then some strategies and tips hopefully you guys can learn from our learnings and lessons so far as you consider this type of program for your own organizations. So a few quick stats on APS. We are a professional society for members of the physiology research community and other people in biomedical sciences. We have 76 full-time staff members, are lucky to have a staff that's diverse in by many measurements: gender, sexual orientation, race, and ethnicity, and notably a long tenure for our staff. Average tenure around 12 years, which can be amazing in some situations. People really have developed a respect and knowledge of each other over the years, great familiarity, which can contribute to very open discussions among our staff team. But the downside of that longevity and familiarity is that we can fall into patterns that we don't necessarily recognize. So just, I'm sure that if you're at an organization that has a very long tenured staff, you're used to the phrase, like, things have been this way. We do it this way because things have always been this way. And because many of us have been around for so long, changing those old behaviors can be pretty uncomfortable sometimes. So this was kind of where we started. And obviously adding to all of this, the stress of the pandemic. We've been remote since March of 2020, and we had really been on a tear trying to innovate and push the envelope for what we could do from home. So in May, when all of this went down with George Floyd, when he was killed, it really felt like a breaking point for many of us, not just the Black people on staff, not just the people of color. I think it was unique in the way that the story of what happened to George Floyd and the video and the discussions and details around that whole incident were portrayed through the media. There was just so much access. So everybody was affected by what was going on deeply. So we, after this, kind of came to where we kicked off the working group, and that was started in July 2020. It was a group that was commissioned by our executive director, Scott Steen, and he laid out several charges for the working group that he wanted to see. And as you can see here, it's, both recommending of policies and guidelines and giving advice, and then coming up with some fun, engaging ways to um, connect with the staff on these topics and really be able to talk through some of what was going on. This is as much of a culture thing as anything else. So making sure that we have a positive culture around DEI that mirrors what we're saying in many of our statements, and the actions that we're taking was really important to him. So we got a really great response from the staff. 13 people responded. And notably, we had more interest from women, not, I guess, surprising. APS is about 70%, 56 out of our 70, 53 out of our 76 employees are female. So more women for sure raised their hands to volunteer. And the two men that were on the working group were our two Black male employees. But positively, we had members from all of our divisions represented, which helped ensure that like anything that was going on in the discussions with the DEI working group had an avenue to get pushed back into wider discussions in the staff team and on the projects that they were working on, which was really important that the conversation around DEI remains present in everything that we do. And then lastly, I'll say on the working group team, we had a really great mix of longtime and newer employees. So that was also adding to the diversity of who was in the room, so to speak, on the Zoom call as it was. So the other thing that I immediately did, I was asked to chair the group, but knowing what a journey getting to where we want to be with DEI would be, I knew I wasn't going to go it alone. So I invited Rebecca to be my co-chair. It was an excellent decision. Anybody who's working on a group like this, there are some heavy topics that you're thinking about and big things that you're trying to accomplish. So I would completely recommend getting a partner who has an interesting and savvy perspective, and can help bounce ideas off of each other when you're trying to make things happen and advance the discussion. So I'm going to pass it to Rebecca so she can give a little bit of a background on some of that history that I mentioned at the beginning that we had laid out for our member team from which we built on.
Thanks, Stacey. So I'm going to talk about where we started as an organization with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So increasing diversity has really been a long-standing priority for APS. And as early as the 1960s, APS recognized that there was a marked lack of diversity within the membership, and it really wanted to take some active steps to address those problems. There was an existing fellowship that was named for William Townsend Porter that was reshaped to provide support for physiologists from underrepresented groups with a goal of increasing diversity within the membership. Over the years, this program has evolved and changed to meet new needs. But in 2017, APS was proud to celebrate 50 years of this program. And that program really remains the flagship of our efforts to diversify the membership even today. But along the way, other programs have also been added, including a Diversity Travel Awards program that was established in 1985. So that's just a little bit about the history of the diversity effort at APS. Looking at our current member initiatives, we have two standing committees that are charged with addressing DEI issues within the membership. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee is charged with promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion within the member community and within the broader discipline of physiology. The Women in Physiology Committee focuses more narrowly on increasing the participation of women in physiology and promoting their success and leadership. So actually, for the last 4 election cycles, we had a woman elected to the presidency of APS, and women make up just over half of our current council. And we're also seeing really good representation of women in other leadership roles, such as within our committees and in our committee chairs. This year, APS is presenting a series of webinars based on DEI topics. And I won't run through all of these, but I do want to call attention to a special screening of the film Picture a Scientist. This is a film that highlights the challenges faced by women who are pursuing careers in science. And in particular, it highlights the issue of intersectionality, which pose particular challenges for scientists who are members of more than one underrepresented group. APS has also recently undertaken a climate survey. And the goal of that survey is really to understand the experiences of our members with respect to DEI issues. And the results are going to help inform our long-term strategy. And that strategy has the end goal of achieving a more inclusive culture. And this is being done in partnership with an outside consulting group that really specializes in DEI issues. And finally, APS has engaged in efforts to develop a number of values and policy statements. This was driven by a member task force that came together after the National Academy's 2018 report on sexual harassment in STEM. But it's really more broad than that, and it goes into issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And importantly, these statements apply not only to members, but also to staff. So I've presented all of this as background to show that DEI was already a deeply ingrained value for APS. But these efforts have been very much aimed at the membership. As the world around us changed, we realized that we needed better ways to support our staff and really bring those efforts more uniformly throughout the organization. This was reinforced in our most recent strategic plan, which specifically calls for increasing diversity and inclusion, not only within the membership, but also within the Society's leadership, volunteers, and staff. So I'll hand it back over to Stacy now to talk about how we got started with our working group efforts.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. So once we convened the working group, there were several additional themes that came up as the group started talking. And in addition to those that Scott had originally laid out for us. And it was really kind of revolving around how could we use our existing culture that I talked about before to use the best parts of it to really open the conversation and the dialogue around DEI as a staff team and what that would look like for us on a day-to-day basis. And how could we foster an environment that would help us grow and communicate better at work and in real life, because I think most of us know that these discussions aren't just happening in one area of our life. Any skills that people develop at work to talk more openly about DEI, I'm sure can be applied at the dinner table. So the other things that we were thinking on is, how could we kind of push beyond the book club? So don't get me wrong, I love a good book club. APS has a book club, and they have read some very engaging and important books on race and just kind of, cultural background of people that are not necessarily the people that we know. But we really wanted to focus on some more concrete business goals, looking at things like whether everybody at the organization was getting equal access to professional development, to promotions, raises, mentoring, advancement. Was everybody feeling seen? Were managers providing that support equitably to everybody on the staff? And if not, why not? Just really equipping people with those tools to have better discussions, and then also look at those underlying sort of HR-focused issues that probably weren't necessarily swept up in the HR net as it was back in July 2020. We really were interested in those concrete questions, as well as the stated goals that we had as a group. So it's been about a year since we started. Like I said, July 2020 is where we got started. And I am biased in this, but I think we've done some great work. There were a few things that were low-hanging fruit that we addressed, and some things that were longer-term projects that we started to set in motion. One really easy, quick win was updating our core values that Rebecca mentioned that have been developed through the task force to include staff. it was a super easy thing. The core values were very complete as they were. So there were just a few places where it said, APS members, and we just added and staff, super easy. Then we developed a position statement for the working group to just set out why we existed and what we were going to be doing for the staff team. So it was really easy for the staff to understand. That position, along with some of the early resources that we were collecting and the notes from our working group meetings and a number of other things, were organized into a SharePoint um, for the whole working group to access and for staff to access as well. We established a page on our staff hub where we also keep some of these resources to make an easy kind of one-stop shop. If not everybody is comfortable with using SharePoint, but everybody does have to go in the staff hub for something. So we thought that was a good place to have those too. We set up some safe space, which was important for us because those didn't exist for APS at the time. And we reserved some safe space time after a few months of meeting and knowing that people were coming to us individually and saying, I kind of would like to talk about something that happened in the news or something that happened that's shaken me up. We started carving out about 30 minutes on every other of our meetings so staff can come in and share how they're feeling. We thought that that was really important. And again, those safe space ground rules are something that we circulate to staff when we are having these type of events. And then, organizing some fun activities. So it's not as heavy, but really the fun activities are focused on expanding information and people's background knowledge of different groups. So trivia contests for Black History Month and for Women's History Month and an International Day, which is one of our most beloved events. So we'll be continuing to look for those ways to continue to have events that celebrate diversity. And then importantly, a DEI staff survey, which Rebecca will talk about in a minute. But before we go on to that, I did just want to show the safe space ground rules that we came up with. This was just from us kind of going around and looking at what other organizations were using to kind of set those parameters for people in those conversations where you wanted someone to come in with an open mind and realize that making a mistake was okay. So just offering this in case it's helpful for anyone else trying to develop, some guidelines around that as well. And I'll hand it back to Rebecca.
Great. So, in terms of thinking about getting started with this work, there was a really strong desire to understand where it was that we were starting from. So, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we already have a fairly diverse staff to begin with. So, our goal wasn't necessarily to change numbers, but rather to really ensure that we're providing an environment where people feel welcome and empowered to do their best work. So we set out to conduct a survey of the staff so that we had a baseline for measuring progress and had some idea of what the working group would need to address in our future activities. In terms of developing the survey, there was a subcommittee of volunteers, and they worked on generating a very long list of questions. And they looked around at what other organizations have done. They looked at similar surveys, and they really brought all of these questions together so that we could take a look, see what we wanted to focus on, and then that was narrowed down by the working group as a whole. Now, we were really fortunate that one of the members of that subcommittee had a lot of professional experience in designing and conducting surveys and analyzing the results. So she was able to guide us in developing a survey that conformed to established professional standards. But as I mentioned, we really relied on examples drawn from other surveys to put ours together. And so it really should be feasible to do this, even if you don't have someone on your staff who has a lot of survey experience. Given the nature of this topic and the fact that there are obvious sensitivities that need to be considered, we were very clear that participation in the survey was optional. And not only was participating in the survey optional, but none of the questions, including those that asked about demographics, were required. We wanted people to feel as safe and comfortable as possible in participating and sharing information. Participation was anonymous, and information is only being shared in aggregate. And importantly, we also offered ourselves, both me and Stacy, as well as other members of the working group, as resources for staff questions as they went through this process. And our experience, this was important because if people got stuck on a question that they didn't understand, or maybe just didn't necessarily know what it was getting at, if they had a way to talk it through, it kept them from just stopping or not completing the survey. So we felt that was pretty important part of the process. So in the end, we actually had 53 participants who completed the survey. And you'll remember that we have about 76 staff, so this was a pretty high participation rate. We were able to compare the responses across demographic categories so that we could sort of get at and assess the experiences of those from different groups. Now, some of these groups had a pretty small number, but so it limits the real power of the survey, but I think it still gives us an idea of what people are experiencing. So average scores across the board were pretty high, which I think indicates that people generally feel pretty positive about the state of DEI in our workplace. And importantly, there were no statistically significant differences that were detected between members of underrepresented racial or ethnic groups when you compared to the Caucasian or white respondents. Where we did see some differences came between responses from men and women and from those who identified as LGBT plus or non-LGBT plus. And these helped us identify a few areas of concern. So to begin with, we have some work to do in the way we talk to each other. Multiple respondents to the survey reported either experiencing or witnessing remarks that were either inappropriate or disparaging in the workplace. The survey further indicated that people weren't quite sure what really crossed the line from professional to inappropriate, and that when this happened, they also weren't clear on how they could respond. So not surprisingly, given the timing of all of this, some of what was reported as being inappropriate had to do with remarks about politics. And this kind of comes from an atmosphere where you might assume that all the people around you hold the same sort of beliefs or ideas that you have. But the fact is, we're all very different. We all have a different perspective. This survey was sent to staff in early 2021. And of course, this was a very tumultuous time socially and politically. And despite the fact that our staff is majority female, the survey results indicate that women are actually less likely to feel supported in their professional development, and less likely to feel valued for their contributions. And finally, both women and staff who identify as LGBT+ were more likely to recognize issues related to diversity in the workplace. So based on these results, the working group is making a number of recommendations. To address some of those issues that are related to inappropriate discussions in the workplace, we're hoping that we'll be able to identify some kind of training experience that focuses on civility within the workplace. After having some discussions around the results, the consensus is that we don't really want to be in the business of policing what people can and can't say. But rather, we want to make sure that people have the tools to both know what is and isn't appropriate and how to handle any situations that might arise. We also learned that we need to make some clear statements and policies with respect to equity and accessibility, and that our staff really want these to go beyond what's expected for standard legal compliance. And they also want these policies and statements to include workplace events and the vendors that we work with. And finally, staff need access to information about how to report any incidents of bias that rise to the level of reportability. There was an assumption that this was clear, but the survey showed that people are feeling unsure about what to do if they observe something that needs to be reported. I'll hand it back over to Stacy for the next slide.
So I get the fun opportunity to talk about some of our wins, because definitely coming off the survey, that was a lot of information to work through. But I think one of the best things that we've done is really open the dialogue about DE&I in a way that we've never had this conversation at APS. We're not where we want to be yet, but we've made the start that we want to make. And we brought those conversations that used to happen between really close colleagues or that didn't happen at all, right out in the forefront of the discussion of what's going on at APS. I think as Rebecca said, the civility piece and kind of the things that we had gotten used to um, underlies the fact that we all still, as a staff team, work very well together. And I think we all have a drive to support each other. So just figuring out the ways that we can plug into that and help ourselves learn how to be better colleagues is, and knowing that that is actually what people want to do is a positive thing as well. I think getting the working group members to the point where they feel confident being DEI ambassadors. So, as Rebecca said, we offered ourselves up for questions during the survey time period, but there have been a lot of other opportunities, I guess you could say, unfortunately, to kind of flex those muscles of being of being that ambassador. We at APS have often tried to figure out what to do about um, you know, things that happen in the world that are disturbing, mass shootings, also natural disasters, injustice that goes on in various places that apply to our members or affect people on our members and staff teams. The rise in Asian American hate has been a recent example of something where we were kind of like, okay, a statement is needed, but also we have colleagues that probably are feeling, the same way that some of us were feeling with George Floyd. There's a number of things that aren't always going to get a statement from the entire organization, but that staff person who reaches out and just checks on you is a really important foundation to supporting each other better. So we really have worked through some of what people feel comfortable doing in terms of putting themselves out there for their colleagues. Not everybody is going to want to go have a conversation with someone after something difficult happens, but people can find a way. So it's really great to open that dialogue as well. What do we feel comfortable doing and reaching out to each other on behalf of? And then, as I mentioned earlier, with that diverse representation on our staff team, it makes it easier to have that DEI theme running through the discussions that we're having in our respective areas on day-to-day decision making. I think Rebecca has a couple really great examples of when this type of thing happened in real life. So if you could just add a couple of those to the discussion, Rebecca.
Sure. So my main role within the organization is within our government relations and science policy office. And one of the things that we do is we take a look at legislation and various policy issues, and we decide whether or not these are issues that the society should or should not support. So with a very much expanded focus on DEI throughout STEM, broader STEM community, we've been called upon to make these decisions more frequently. And that's kind of prompted us to think about, where do we really stand as an organization? And I was able to bring some of these discussions within the DEI working group with the staff. And I think that my colleagues really pushed me to look a little bit more broadly at these issues rather than just sort of through my narrow, policy focus. And they were really instrumental, I think, in helping us think about what we could do on a broader range of issues within the policy world. And then another example comes from our publications program. So APS is also a publisher of scientific journals. And we have some representatives of our publications program on the DEI working group. And so we were able to speak with them about a new policy they were working on, which has to do with author name changes. So if we have an author, someone who's published in one of our journals, who wants to change their name on a paper that's already been published, in the past, there wasn't really an easy way to do this. But we have a new policy, which is available on our website. When you publish a paper with us, you'll find it quite easily. And the new policy is that if you wish to change your name, APS will update and republish any past papers. They'll also update the associated metadata, which has to do with how articles are indexed and findable. And importantly, this does not require notification of co-authors, and there are no corrections notices generated. It's just a change in the name. And the policy is really intended to allow our authors to use the professional name that they prefer. And so this was a great example of a couple of different ways that through the working group convening, we were able to bring some of these principles through different parts of the organization.
Right. So So let me talk about a few of the next steps that we're thinking about at this moment. So obviously, like I said, with the DEI survey, that was a lion's share of the work that we've done so far. It was quite an undertaking. So following up on those survey recommendations, and as Rebecca also mentioned previously, we are working with a DEI consultant on the member side, who also is looking at some of the things going on the staff side. So connecting the dots between the consultant's work, what we found in the survey, what our HR team is working on to increase some of those or make more clear some of those organizational policies and some of those equity issues on a more official level within the workforce. That'll be quite a fair amount of continuing work that we'll have to do there. We'd like to continue to bring relevant content to everyone. And I think one of the things that, um, you know, is central to that is really optimizing the working group's time and talents. Because, I mean, we're all very busy and it does not make it easier to, have a passion project that you really want to do really well for your staff team and really inform them of a ton of other things that are going on, but then really like racing against the clock. I mean, I think what we've come up against so far has been, the number of awareness months that exist in general on the calendar. And how do we recognize all of these very important affinity groups with the same kind of level of effort? Can we pull 25 resources for every single awareness day? Not sure. Does anyone have the time to do that? Not sure about that either. So I think we have really big ideals and goals, but we have to be realistic. So trying to find a balance there is going to be important for us going forward. And then I think the other one is engaging the people who haven't necessarily engaged in these discussions. Again, like Rebecca alluded to, these don't start and stop at work. These are many times important and deeply held beliefs that people have that we're asking people to at least consider something that is not something that they had been considering previously, or care about something that is not specifically within the mission of the organization previously, had not been as central on a staff level to the mission of the organization. These DEI discussions, people who kind of would like to just get back to doing our work. So really finding a way to talk to those folks. We've thought about a few different possibilities, such as having a family history series where people can talk about, where they come from. Everybody has something that they want to brag about their ancestors, right? So giving people a place to talk about the accomplishments and the highlights and the things that made it to the top of the list that have gotten passed down. Because, there's a whole lot of stuff that happened with our ancestors that we never hear about. So those highlights that people are proud of, we would love to give an opportunity for people to be able to share those things with each other. You learn something about the individual, you learn something about where they come from, and everybody can feel proud of where they're from and what they bring to the organization. So just trying to find those things that don't feel as specific to DEI, but do underscore the values of diversity and celebration of people's backgrounds. We're looking for other ways to engage all of those individuals. So, and then I guess the last thing that I would say in terms of the time and talents of the group on the working group is thinking about some term limits, because this can be sort of heavy work, and not sort of, this is heavy work, and it can take a toll. And there's a lot of things to consider. It's such a journey. So we have to be able to pass the baton to other people who have an interest, because again, that helps us weave through, priorities of different individuals, all moving in the direction of a better, more diverse, more equitable workplace. So all of that being said, I would say that the challenge is worth it. There's a perception that these conversations are hard, but what the last year has shown us is this is a worthwhile journey. And if we just keep focused on where we want to be, then we will continue to make progress getting there. So the working group has been, to this point, very excited to help APS get to the place that they want to go. And I definitely think it's a challenge worth accepting. And I hope that you all consider doing the same in your organizations. So thank you very much for listening. And we are here to answer your questions. Hi, everyone. Just opening up the conversation for any questions that you might have. Obviously, we pre-recorded that. We couldn't remember the outfits we had on to do the real, the hard fake on that we were doing that live. So, but here and happy to answer any questions. So please drop them in the chat or chime in with anything that you'd like to know. It's possible that we totally explain that fully. So that's always fun too, but we do invite any questions. Okay, so how do you balance staff expectations and needs when a committee is more member focused? So, and thanks for that question, Nicole. It's really different. I think it's really easy to, we always are putting our members first, and the lens that we're looking at just about everything through is how can we better serve the members? And actually, I think until a few years ago, we didn't have a focus at APS on really putting the staff out there at all. To pull in what the staff was doing that was not on behalf of the members. And even with this, I don't think we've been super vocal with our members about what we're doing in the working group up to this point. But I think that's kind of important because sometimes you do need those things where the staff is just able to connect with each other and really prioritize the things that are very high importance level to them. And I think the survey was so informative to us because, again, these were questions we had never asked anyone. So seeing that, some of the things that we thought were going to show up didn't show up, I think we were very surprised by the way that women felt about being valued and recognized in the organization. So that just kind of uncovered a lot of things that we had been focusing time on with our members. Like Rebecca was talking about our Women in Physiology Committee. We spend a great deal of time talking about how to uplift women in leadership, but maybe we weren't having those conversations on staff. So I think they mirror, because obviously our colleagues had the same concerns to some degree, but without taking off the member lens, taking off that member focus, I don't think we would have ever gotten to these discussions. I mean, I don't know about you, Rebecca, what do you think?
No, I think you really got to it there, Stacey. And I think it's also about thinking about how we empower our colleagues to feel confident and seen in their work, and that these issues really matter for them too, and that it's not just something that we do for our members, but it is also something that we need to do for our staff. And, I know you talked a lot about this being new for us. And, I think we really are hoping that we will start to see some increased confidence and just feeling more positive about that in the future. We've had a couple of other questions come in. Marissa asked, do you have any specific training tools you'd suggest? We have a small staff, a very engaged and supportive board, and members who are in a variety of places related to DEI. I don't know that we've really looked at training tools. Does anything come to mind for you, Stacey?
I mean, I think we wanted to have speakers for sure. I think we were looking for places where there was going to be overlap with what was being done for our members. So as Rebecca mentioned, we have a DEI consultant that's working with us on some higher level work for our membership, that we knew they were going to be, coming up with a number of suggestions about, kind of the avenues we could go down. So we wanted to piggyback on what they were talking about, but I think that was why we knew that the survey was going to be so important, Because I think the first thing that we said to each other when we first started talking about this is like, where do you start? I think everybody has heard of sensitivity training. We didn't even know if that's what we needed. So just going through the steps to see where we were at baseline is going to help us decide on any specific tools. But I think what we had in mind initially was we'd like to get some speakers, maybe a facilitator to do some exercises with us, but we need to know what to ask them for in the first place when we get started, and what the needs are of the staff that are most important that we want to address first. So yeah, I would agree, not necessarily a tool, but just trying to take advantage of what was already going on to see how we could dovetail and get the content to people that needed to be there. Still a work in progress also.
And then the next question that came in was, do you have any ideas for how to go about doing something like this at a smaller organization, less than 25 staff, or those that are even smaller, that might not have as many people to help share the load of this kind of working group? And that's a great question. Stacy talked some about how we engage our committee members, and the fact is that everyone has a full-time job already, and that taking this on it's a challenge. I think even in an organization as large as ours, where we do have, maybe a little bit more bandwidth. I will say there were, as you look at different things that you can do, I think there are some that are easier to get started on than others. So some of the things like, coming up with and sharing resources on a regular basis. If you could start with some of that low-hanging fruit that might just be easier to get started on. And then, just as you think about it and prioritize what you think might be most important for your organization, so you're not taking on too much or everything at once, but just, what you can handle at any given time. Stacy, I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I would also say two things. One, maybe it's not a formal working group, but maybe there's a couple of people with an interest who are kind of assigned to bring up DEI within the conversations going on in the organization. So it may not be that it's a group that comes together every other week to talk about, X, Y, and Z, like what education do we want to bring to the staff, but an understanding that DEI is important to the group, and that topic will be brought up when it, throughout everything. We have to weave it into all of our discussions. So that could be really powerful. And the other thing that I would say is perhaps this is the time when you as a staff team start taking advantage of some of the professional development opportunities you have available. So, if you're a member of CES has great DEI related content that you can listen to as a team, send out a shared request for calendar that everybody comes to some of these sessions and listens together. And then you just have maybe a brown bag lunch or debrief with the group who attended, or, take it back and present something in a staff meeting. So it doesn't have to be like a set aside function if you don't have the bandwidth to do that. And we totally understand, because even in a large organization, everybody's moving in a million directions. So I know that everybody wears so many hats in smaller organizations. So I would suggest that do some things together and open the conversation and then talk about it afterwards.
A couple of questions came in about this survey, whether we have plans to resurvey after a certain number of years. We didn't set out to do that again in any given time frame, but I do think that it is something we will look at, because part of what we wanted to do was establish a baseline and see if we were making progress. So yes, I think we do plan to use it again, and I don't know how long it will be. We'll have to think about that. And we're also, as I mentioned, working with the outside DEI consulting group, which has also done some work with the staff. So I think all of that will kind of combine to help us establish our starting place and think about how we're going to measure progress. And then someone else asked if we were willing to share the questionnaire. And I think that's a question we would bring back to our working group to talk about. I think there's nothing necessarily proprietary about it, but, since we are working together, we would want to make that decision together too. Stacy, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that says it all. I think with the survey, we have to we really were kind of building the plane as we were flying it there, just, not really knowing where to start. And Rebecca mentioned that one of the people on our team is really talented in survey design and development. So she's on that committee and was giving a lot of input on how to put the survey together. But I think even without that help, and I think Rebecca touched on this a little bit, it's worth just putting some rudimentary questions together. It's worth looking online and seeing if you can get, some templates of the type of questions and then adjust it to the needs of your organization. Don't overlook what you already know about your organization to ask specific questions and inform, and ask specific questions that will make their way into your survey. So it is developing more of a tailored situation for you to start with to your group. But, I think Rebecca's right. We'll take it back to the working group and talk to them about it. And we'd be happy to, figure out a way to get the survey to the attendees of this session if you guys are interested in having those. And one other thing that I'll say about the working group that I think is important, the safe space ground rules that we shared before have been kind of a guiding factor for how the working group talks to each other. And I think that this is important to have some confidentiality, very clearly stated, and, ground rules of how the team will work together, because all of this is really so grounded in trust, and it's trust on a different level. It's not trust like, I know this person's going to hit their deadlines and they're not going to leave me hanging, or they're going to talk to a member and, represent the organization well, or whatever. It's trust with talking about things that you might not have ever uttered to anyone else, like we've been faced with, a lot of situations that have brought up these conversations that, like I said, don't often happen in public with multiple people that you aren't very close with. So keeping in mind that, really laying out the ground rules, having the team decide together what those ground rules will be, having some privacy. We mentioned that the notes that we take in our meeting are in our SharePoint, but that's not open to the whole staff. That's only open to the group, the working group members. We don't record those calls. So if somebody misses it, we'll just have to fill them in, but there's no record of those discussions because it's just so sensitive. So just keep those things in mind as you go forward. People may or may not really feel like chiming in real time. So Rebecca and I have made ourselves open and available to people if they want to have offline conversations about anything, and that goes for the staff too. So there's a lot of sensitivity that just doesn't come into play in our normal work that you really should keep in mind when you're setting up whatever group it is. When you're having these discussions, really just let people know, nobody's here to bite each other's heads off. We just want to have this discussion and make our workplace better and more inclusive for everyone who's here.
And I'll also say with that I think it's been powerful for me to just have this working group exist and be a place that people can come to have some of these discussions when things happen, because I think when something happens, you reel a little bit and you don't know how to kind of connect with other people on it. And I think that it's been a place for that to happen, and that's been pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen any other questions come in from the chat.
Yes, so we'll go ahead and wrap the session, give everybody about 7 minutes back, a little bit more than that, because right now we're coming up on a break. So I believe the session start again at 1:45, and we will see everybody back at that time. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.